Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to today's webinar sponsored by the Science Philanthropy Alliance. I'm France Cordova, President of the Alliance. As you may know, the Science Philanthropy Alliance is a growing community of more than 40 philanthropic organizations committed to advancing science through visionary philanthropy. Our work focuses on increasing philanthropic funding for science and making science philanthropy more impactful and effective. With support from our members, we advise philanthropists and their staff on the approaches to funding science. We convene philanthropic science funders for shared learning and collaboration. We also work to position and promote science philanthropy to ensure that it's recognized as a key contributor to the research ecosystem alongside the federal government, universities, and industry. As part of this work in our new strategic plan, we look at the data on science funding in the US, which we call indicators. And we published our inaugural 2023 Science Philanthropy Indicators report in a print format, led by Alliance's Strategy Director, Kate Lowry. About the same time, our colleagues at the UC San Diego Frontiers in Science and Innovation Policy, under the leadership of Bob Kahn and in collaboration with Chris Martin, published a similar analysis, also highlighting the importance of science philanthropy in the US. So this year, we decided to join forces. We published together our 2025 Science Philanthropy Indicators report in a new and interactive format that can endure and be easily updated, so you can have the latest data at your fingertips. We look at the data on funding from the federal government in particular, and also philanthropy, universities, and industry, because all four sectors are vital parts of the research ecosystem. So it's our pleasure to present the report publicly and show you a lot of the data right now. We hope you'll find it interesting and useful for your work. Now I'd like to invite some remarks from Bob Kahn, former board chair of the Science Philanthropy Alliance and former president of the Kavli Foundation and leader of the UC San Diego Frontiers in Science and Innovation Policy. Most recently, we're happy to reinforce, Bob received the very prestigious award from the National Science Board called the Vannevar Bush Award, which honors exceptional leaders in science and technology. So Bob, over to you. You're on mute, Bob?
Yes, thank you, France. I thought I'd just make a few comments so that we can get to the meat of what this meeting is about. And I'll focus on the situation of federal funding and what philanthropy might do about it. You're all very well aware that the administration's proposed budgets for science were disastrous. And the only reason they haven't remained totally disastrous is that Congress has entered the picture, and the appropriations from both the House and Senate are much more reasonable with respect to support of the science agencies. However, they haven't reconciled, and there's no bill, and now we have a government shutdown. So we'll see what comes. And just one final point about that, the House and the Senate numbers differ. And particularly the House number for the NSF is about 2 billion below its 9 billion rough number from a year ago. So that would be a significant cut. Not as much as Trump proposed, but quite significant. I think from an outlook point of view, expect the same in 2026, FY 2026. The other thing that's changed is since the last time we reported here is, I would call it the ferociousness of the attack of the administration on universities. It's unprecedented. And the latest effort, which we have written an op-ed about, is this 10-point program where universities are asked to sign on in exchange for preferred federal funding. You may have read that MIT has declined, and I can't think of a better lead responder than someone of the stature of MIT. But that's extraordinarily dangerous for the future of not just free speech, but a future of how our universities have historically operated. And that freedom of operation is what has led us to have the extraordinary scientific enterprise that we have. That's the threat that the universities are now under. I would comment about one final thing, and that is human capital, people. We are not finding in the enrollments going into the coming year that either American citizens or permanent residents here are taking up the slack of the absence of foreign students, particularly when it comes to graduate programs in STEM and medicine. And what that means, and some of the universities, MIT is, for example, have cut their enrollments at the graduate level by 10% or more. So if this continues, what it means is that you're basically eating the seed corn of the future. You will not have the human capital necessary to carry on the country's programs, even if they were reasonably funded. So bearing all of that in mind, if these issues go on over the next 4 years, we're in extraordinarily serious trouble. You cannot recover from 4 years of decline in people coming into the business, so to speak. That's the human capital problem. And I'll stop there and say, to the degree that this can be something of an additional focus on the part of philanthropic organizations, in the context of what we're facing, it would be an extraordinary contribution. I, as a former president of a foundation, know how hard it is to change programs that have been around quite a while and free up money. But I would argue to you, the country's in a crisis when it comes to science and staffing. And to the degree that you all think in your own ways how you might augment the support available to students going into STEM, that can only be a positive for the country. And with that, let me stop and thank you very much.
Okay, and thank you, Bob. And now I'd like to introduce Kate Lowry and Chris Martin, who are going to present an overview of the report. Kate Lowry is the Strategy Director of the Science Philanthropy Alliance. She leads initiatives and cross-sector partnerships to advance the Alliance's strategic plan, such as the Science Philanthropy Indicators report. Kate has a PhD in Earth System Science from Stanford University with a specialty in oceanography. Chris Martin is former Director of Physical Sciences and Associate Vice President of Operations at the Kavli Foundation. He is working with the UC San Diego Frontiers in Science and Innovation Policy as a consultant on science and philanthropy projects while living in New Zealand. Chris has a PhD in physics from UC Santa Barbara. First, I'll turn it over to Kate, who will present an overview, and then she will turn it over to Chris, who will give a live demo of the site, which is something that you'll be easily able to do after this conversation. You'll be able to go in there and really play around with and do things in a live way. So questions are welcome at any time using the Q&A box, and depending on how pertinent, significant the question is, we may interrupt our speakers to ask it, or we may wait until they're finished. We'll monitor the box for your questions, and we'll also, of course, have time for additional Q&A at the end. So Kate, over to you.
Great. Thank you, France, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. We're really pleased to share our second Science Philanthropy Indicators report, which we launched just at the end of August. And as France mentioned, it builds on our first Indicators report, which we published in 2023. And the whole series is inspired by the National Science and Engineering Indicators that's produced by the National Science Board, where we take the data and we put a philanthropic lens to it to help illuminate some of the different types of funding coming to support science. So our first report highlighted the growing importance of science philanthropy and its increasing role in supporting basic research at universities and at nonprofit research organizations. It also showed that in recent years, funding for applied research has grown more quickly than funding for basic research has at these institutions. We heard that the report was highly impactful for funders, researchers, and other stakeholders. So, for example, last year, the report was cited in Marcia McNutt's inaugural State of the Science address, and it helped make the case to expand the National Academy's Government University Industry Research Roundtable to include philanthropy, and it's now called the Government University Industry Philanthropy Research Roundtable. We've also heard personal stories from philanthropic funders, researchers, and development officers, including some of you on the call here today, about how beneficial it's been for your work. So as Franz mentioned, for this year's report, we're very pleased to collaborate with Chris Martin and with Bob Kahn at the UC San Diego Frontiers in Science and Innovation program. And our collaboration is especially important because both groups have been working together and with NSF to advocate for improved data collection and reporting on science philanthropy. So in their 2023 analysis, Bob Kahn's group was particularly interested in the role of legacy philanthropy, or the annual payouts from university endowments that have been built up from past philanthropic giving and from investment returns that's now being used to support research. Using a variety of sources, they concluded that approximately 25% of university funds used for research are in fact legacy philanthropy. And that's in addition to the current philanthropy from private foundations and other nonprofit funders. So we adopt and build on these estimates of legacy philanthropy and current philanthropy in this year's report, joining forces to present a unified view. And we note that while the numbers in our report are based on the best available data, better data on science philanthropy in the US and around the world are still needed. So our partnership seeks to highlight the role of philanthropy as an important sector of the research enterprise and to encourage more philanthropic funding for research as a flexible complement to federal funding. We're especially excited that this year's report is fully interactive, which means you can dive into the report and explore the areas that you're most interested in. It features the latest available data from the NSF National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, representing a 70-year time series from 1953 to 2023. In addition to the overall trends in R&D funding, this year's report includes a new look at specific fields and subfields of science and engineering, and at graduate students and postdocs. And as already mentioned, we know that supporting the next generation of scientists is of great interest to the research community and to the philanthropic funders in our network. So we'll update the report as new data become available. And we want to note that it's already live at indicators.sciphil.org and that it's best to view it on a computer instead of a mobile device. So today I'll present an overview of our key findings, and then Chris and I will share some highlights from the report, including a live demo. So here are some of our key findings. Of course, the federal government is the largest research funder for both basic and applied research at universities and nonprofits, totaling $58.6 billion, or about 51% of the total in 2023. We estimate that the philanthropic contribution is $24.2 billion, or 21%. And this includes $16.8 billion in current philanthropy and $7.4 billion in legacy philanthropy at these universities and nonprofit research organizations. And again, you'll recall that legacy philanthropy is the support provided by the annual payouts from institutional endowments that have been built up from past giving and investment gains. Further, we find that universities self-funded an additional $19.2 billion, or 17%, through other non-philanthropic revenue sources, which can include patient care, patent revenue, debt financing, and more. We find that if the president's budget were enacted, we estimate that federal funding for research at universities and nonprofit research organizations would drop by 37% to $36.9 billion. And as we'll later show, this would take us back to the amount of funding available for research nearly a quarter century ago. Continuing on in our key findings, especially looking at R&D by field and at graduate students and postdocs, we see that most science R&D expenditures, about 74% at universities, are for the life sciences, totaling $62.2 billion in 2023. And this is true across all funding sources, ranging from 72% for federal and university funding sources to 79% for philanthropy to 87% of business expenditures on science are for the life sciences. An additional $17.5 billion is for engineering R&D at universities. And the federal government, we find, supports about 25% of doctoral students and nearly 50% of postdocs in science and engineering. And then finally, we look at the percentage of international graduate students and postdocs and find that 47% of all graduate students and 58% of postdocs in the US in 2023 were international. We see notable differences across fields as you go in and explore. So 80% of all graduate students in computer science were international in 2023. I'll share more details as we dive into the report, but these are some of the key findings that we especially wanted to highlight. So here we are at the first section of the report, and here we're looking at the performers of US R&D, especially at basic research. So you can, and this is based on the latest NSF National Patterns data release, which was published in February of this year. So you can see that in 2023, the US spent $138 billion on basic research, representing about 15% of all R&D spending. We note that another 18% is for applied research and the rest is for development. And we use the same definitions as in the NSF survey. So basic research is focused on the most basic understanding about the foundations of our world. Applied research is defined as basic science knowledge creation that is directed towards solving problems. And development is applying knowledge from research to new or improved products and processes. And so as you can see here, about half, or 47% of the basic research expenditures were performed by universities in red, and an additional 10% by nonprofit research organizations in orange. About a third of basic research expenditures were performed by the business sector, that's shown in gray here. Often the results of corporate research are not made public, so that limits its potential impact. And of course, we note that industry is a much greater performer of applied research and development. Overall, about 78% of all R&D in the US is performed by the business sector. So in the interactive report, you can click around and explore how those numbers compare across sectors and across R&D type. Here we're looking now at the funders of US R&D and especially basic research. And we focus just on universities and nonprofit research institutions for the rest of this section. So in 2023, we see that these institutions performed $78 billion in basic research expenditures, representing an increase of 20% over the last 10 years after adjusting for inflation. The federal government, which is shown in blue, supported $39.5 billion, or 51% of these expenditures. University institutional funds in red supported $18.2 billion, or 23% of the basic research expenditures at universities. And this includes legacy philanthropy, again, derived from the annual payout from endowments from past giving, as well as other non-philanthropic revenue sources, such as patient care, patent revenue, tuition, debt financing, and more. We see that philanthropic and nonprofit sources in orange represented $11.9 billion, or 15%. Business contributed $5.2 billion, or 7%. And state and local governments contributed about $3 billion, or 4% of all basic research at these institutions. So you can see that the federal government remains the largest player, but together universities and nonprofits are funding an increasing share. Now, given the proposed changes to the federal indirect cost reimbursements, you may be wondering how indirect costs fit into these data. Indirect costs are attributed to the original funding source in the survey data. So for example, the federal portion includes both the direct and the indirect federal support for research at universities and nonprofit research organizations. Here we look at the relative sources of funding, and we can see that this funding landscape reflects a shift over time. This is, again, the relative sources of funding for basic research at universities and nonprofit research organizations. And we actually combine the contributions of universities and nonprofits in red, since both are associated, at least to some extent, with philanthropy. In 2023, the federal government, again, supported 51% of the basic research performed by universities and nonprofits, compared to 76% of the total in 1965. And meanwhile, higher education and nonprofit funding in red have become a significant and increasing source of support. Together, these two sources supported 39% of the basic research at these institutions, compared to just 14% in 1965. And when we click to include applied research, we see similar trends. So here and in the next couple slides, we look at the various funding sources for basic and applied research at universities and nonprofit research organizations. So at this point, all of the previous data we've shown you are directly from NSF, from their survey data. And here we apply our own analysis to these data to better understand the role and the different types of philanthropy. Again, the federal government in blue is the largest funder of basic and applied research at $58.7 billion. Current philanthropy in orange, or the support from private foundations, grant-making public charities, and other nonprofit funders, we estimate to be $16.8 billion. Legacy philanthropy in peach, or the institutional funds from past giving to endowments, we estimate to be $7.4 billion at universities and nonprofit research organizations. And then in red, the portion that is self-funded by universities from non-philanthropic sources, we estimate to be $19.2 billion. So we can see that universities are playing an under-recognized role, just as philanthropy is, and they're increasingly self-funding more and more of their own research expenditures. In our report, we outline all of our definitions and methods, and we're of course happy to answer questions here as well. So this slide shows how the funding flows from the funding sources on the left to the university and nonprofit research organization performers on the right. And you can see that all of these funding sources play an important role for research. So for example, in the interactive site, you can hover over the numbers and see that, for example, current philanthropy in orange, which totals $16.8 billion, is split pretty evenly between universities, which receive $8.3 billion from current philanthropy, and nonprofit research organizations, which will receive $8.5 billion. However, as these funding flows also illustrate, philanthropy and other private sources cannot replace federal funding. Rather, philanthropy is most impactful and effective when it serves as a flexible, catalytic, and risk-taking complement to federal funding, leveraging the scientific infrastructure and capabilities that have been built over decades with government support. So as we've already discussed, we're all very interested in understanding what would happen to the federal support if the president's budget for 2026 were enacted. Chris spent a lot of time thinking about this, so I'll turn it over to him now to tell you more, and then he'll move into the interactive report to share some highlights from the other two sections.
So thank you so much, Kate. And this is also an opportunity for me to switch my screen to the interactive report. We have the same slide pulled up. So first off, to explain where the data came from. So we've been telling you up through 2023, the data that is collected by the NSF and publish them, they purposely have a lag in order to make sure the data has been completely vetted and understood and all of the question marks taken out. But things are changing very rapidly in the current environment, and so we wanted to be able, for some places, to be able to project into the future, and this is one of those key places to be able to do that. So a little bit of the methodology here. One can actually get the breakdown for basic research, applied research development at all of the federal agencies over many years into the past, and also the breakdown that they go to the various entities, the federal, university, nonprofit, et cetera. Using that and assuming the percentage of those distributions to the performers and of the type of research that, as they were in 2023, would remain constant, we were able to use the total figures for the U.S. government for out years and then the president's budget request for 2026, and applying those percentages to be able to predict what the president's budget request would do in 2026. But so, for instance, if you were curious just about basic research instead of applied research, you can click the button, which causes my, sorry. Problem of doing this in live, Rand. I have to click to warm back up again. Now, if I do it, there we go. The graphs will change in real time to adapt to whatever type of question you're wanting. If you'd want just the universities, for instance, you could filter that out, and I encourage you to try these things out. So as we mentioned, we are going to be periodically updating the webpage, and as Bob indicated, this is one of the particular ones where there's a lot of live changes happening in real time. There's various draft bills in the House and Senate. Nothing has been passed yet. Our trigger point to actually update this slide will be when there's something concrete, something that's actually been passed into law that we can point at. But there are some other sources, and these are specifically mentioned here on the bottom of this slide, where if you're really interested in that live data and you want to know day to day how things are changing, both the American Institute of Physics, the AIP, and the AAAS have web pages where they do their best to track these various draft bills and understand what's going to be happening to various specific agencies and various other aspects. So I also encourage you to take a look at those web pages as well. Uh,
Chris,
Go ahead.
excuse me, Chris, before you move on, there's a question that's relevant here. One of our attendees asked about a corporate or industry-sponsored research and where that falls in the data. So since you're live, you could just switch over there and show them.
Exactly. So I just changed the filters so that the performers are business. So as we saw in previous slides, business produces funds, self-funds a lot of their own work. So if the performer is business, you're unsurprisingly going to see that business research is very high for their funding. They do get some funding from government sources. This is applied research. Let's just turn on. Turns out business also spends most of its time doing development. So I should really turn on the development switch. And here you'd see the total, all types of R&D performed by business, what it would happen. So this is an example of the sort of thing that you can do. You can also see that the federal government is an important part. They would get about $30 billion from the federal government for all types of R&D in this situation. So thanks for the question. And this is exactly the sorts of things you can dive in and answer in a live demo like this. So we're now going to move on. As we pointed out, the dominant funders of basic and applied research are universities and nonprofit institutions. And what you find is that the NSF has a second survey called the HERD, the Higher Education Research and Development Survey. And the HERD allows us to dive deeper into the details of what's happening at universities from all of the different funding sources. Once again, I've got all the sources on, but if you're curious just about federal or whatnot, you can change these click boxes here. And what you see is that the life sciences are by far and away the largest recipient of R&D spending of any entity at universities. But there's substantial funds going to other places. And if I'm just hypothetically turn everything off but federal, this will update to show you just the federal component. And unsurprisingly, the federal government follows that same pattern that most of their funding goes towards the life sciences. Engineering, of course, is also a crucial component of the R&D landscape as well. And so we've created a similar plot that you can look at the various major disciplines in R&D. There were a total of 11.5 billion across all fields in engineering in 2023, and it was mostly evenly divided between all of the major disciplines of engineering. And once again, feel free to play with these various switches. So let's dive in a little bit to see what one can go deeper. Let's go back to science. And I mentioned that the life sciences was one of the biggest places here. So the NSF further subcategorizes each of the major fields of science and engineering into finer and finer subfields. So within life sciences, they divide it into health sciences, natural resources conservation, health sciences, biological and agricultural sciences. And perhaps it's no big surprise that the health sciences is by far the largest component of what's going on. But if you were curious about something else and you want to say, okay, what's happening in computer and information sciences, you can switch that. Now, bear in mind, if you're doing this, you might want to switch to engineering if you want to get all different kinds of engineering and whatnot. But in any case, I should also point out, since I've done this, if you switch something and things disappear, that's because the subfields only exist within the discipline. So the things work from top to bottom, where the biggest subdivision here now is science. I've now subdivided into computer information sciences, etc., as you go down the screen. But yes, basically a 35% increase over 2013 rather, for computer and information sciences. This is, as you might imagine, reflective of the increasing interest in computer sciences and other fields within academia and elsewhere in society more broadly. So if you're now saying, okay, great, that's what the fields themselves are doing from sources, where do the funds come from? And we felt this was a particularly important thing for us to highlight. Um, so now switching it around, instead of saying, let's do a graph about fields, now it's a graph showing the sources of funding that are coming from. And let me highlight something else. You'll notice that as I've been moving my mouse around, these little pop-up boxes appear. So if you're curious about a particular year, a particular spot, you can just mouse over and it will show you the exact numbers that feed into that particular place in the graph. Or perhaps you want to just highlight one particular aspect of things like the federal government. You can also click dynamically on the sources on this side as well. Um,
So Chris, there's
yep.
a question that's
Yep.
relevant here. Does federal funding refer to just NSF or just NIH or all federal
So
science
that's
agencies?
such a great question. It actually takes me to the next tab of the interactive report because it turns out federal is all sorts of funding. And so, further subdividing federal, we're able to break the federal funding up by agency. And so, this next chart allows you to do exactly that and to ask which agencies are actually funding in the federal government. So, we start all of these tabs that are on the webpage has a default starting point. This one's default starting point is to show you all disciplines, all fields. And if you look across all federal funding for all disciplines and all fields, the NIH is by far and away the largest supplier of federal funding. But you might say, well, actually, what I care about is the physical sciences. And so you could say, all right, let's put the physical sciences as what I care about. And it changes, right? The NSF being the dominant funder in the physical sciences. So all of these graphs, allow you to do exactly that question as well. Um, but similarly, if you care about the DoD, so I should also mention this graph only lets you see 2023. If for some reason you're interested in past years, that data does exist at the NCSES, the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, which is a branch of the National Science Foundation. That's where they're the ones who actually do the herd. But we've found that this is a much more dynamic and interactive way of interacting with that NSF data. So we want to move on. So I see a question about STTR funding. STR funding is included in the federal funds, but it doesn't get pulled out separately in the herd data. So there's not a way for us to graph that separately, but it includes it. The next major piece of data that we wanted to focus on was the students. As Bob alluded to, that is the crucial energy that makes science possible. This is now switching to another survey that the NSF does. It's called the Survey of Graduate Students and Postdocs in Science Engineering. Its most recent data is 2023, and similarly, as the NSF releases additional data, we will be updating this to show future years. So this graph is the 2023 data, and similarly, if you care, let's say about engineering instead, you can swap those numbers around. And they provide breakdowns by master students versus doctoral students versus postdocs. And I should also mention this is across all universities. The R1, R2, and R3 universities are the dominant place, but there are still a sizable number, especially of master students that are at non R1 through R3 institutions, and they're included here as well. So, similarly with the students, you can ask questions like who supports the students? There it goes. Um, Here you'll see that the source of support for grad students is generally done through university institutional and self. This is now for all science disciplines across all years. But let's say it's like, well, what about doctoral students, not just the master's students? And there you'll see the story changes substantially. When you look at doctoral students, now the university support actually becomes very important in the sciences. So what you were seeing before was a lot of the master's students who are self-supporting themselves in their studies. But one of the things that changes is you may have said, wait, what happened to all of those out years? The NSF has periodically changed the way it does its surveys, and how it asks its questions. And it wasn't until 2017 that they began to separate doctoral students and master's students from each other. Pre 2017, they lumped all graduate students together. So it's not actually possible to show just doctoral students pre 2017. Um, so let's keep going so we can show you all of these different things. If you're curious, for instance, about postdocs, we'll now switch to the postdoc question. And that was actually supposed to show something. What happened? This is the joy of doing a live demo. I don't know why it decided to do that to me. So we'll just keep on going here and I'll figure out what happened later. Let's go now to federal agencies. So similarly, the breakdown that we were able to do with funding, we can do with federal agency support as well. So this is now breaking down where the federal support for the grad students and postdocs come from. And once again, unsurprisingly, this is going to differ by discipline. If I choose, something that is more in the health space, unsurprisingly, the NSF is going to become a dominant player. Sorry, the NIH is a dominant player. If I choose something that's more in the physical sciences, you'll more strongly see other agencies, like, for instance, the National Science Foundation, becoming the dominant funder of things. This does, however, highlight one thing that I want to show. If you switch, I'll switch back to let's say, the biological sciences. Things changed a little bit in 2017. I wanted to pick one. You notice that there was a big change. I just picked a random field. This happens to be zoology. You're like, what happened? Did zoology suddenly explode in 2017? There's a rather important little subnote here that the NSF made field and subcategorization changes in 2017. So if you see a glitch in 2017, that's because they redefined the field. So zoology was a field that the NSF tracked pre-2017 and post-2017, but they lumped different subfields, in this case of geology, you see this in other places as well, into it. So if you really care about this transition between 2016 and 2017, it's actually really important to look at this technical note that the NSF produced when they released the 2017 numbers, because they actually detail exactly all the swaps. I tried to follow the swaps, but it was actually sufficiently complicated. They took things from various places that it's not actually possible to make a smooth transition and extrapolate between 2016 and 2017. So that's just one of those things that you have to work with as you deal with data like this. Last but not least, let me take you to an issue that is definitely relevant today, which has to do with international students. Go
Chris,
ahead.
just before you do that, because we have a question relevant to what you just discussed, given the definition of subfields, where does climate science research fit within the broader disciplinary landscape? Or is it distributed among the various categories like earth, atmospheric, etc.?
Yeah, so there isn't a specific, if I have all fields, you'll notice there's not, for instance, a specific climate science spot. Some of it's going to live in atmospheric chemistry. Some of it's going to live in more of a forestry type place. So there's not a place where they gather all climate science place under one category. It's distributed as it is. You go around.
Thank you.
Going back to international students, this is now looking at all science graduate students over since 1980 across all disciplines. But also going down here to the bottom, you can see how different fields, and this is sorted actually by percentage of grad students. So you notice, for instance, in information technology, 86% of all grad students in 2023 were non-U.S. citizens. Now, I should mention here their definition of U.S. citizens also includes legal permanent residents, so people who are on a permanent basis in the U.S. So another way of phrasing this would be people who are on temporary visas is what the NSF defines as foreign students in this context. And that's true across computer sciences. And if you are curious just about computer science. Let's limit that particular filter to computer science. And you'll see that's been rising through the years. In 1980, it was only about 31%, whereas across all of computer science now 80%. And that's 90,000 students out of 113,000 students in the computer sciences. You can similarly, well, ask, well, what about doctoral students? There's a lot fewer doctoral students, but still 66% of all doctoral students in the computer sciences are foreign nationals. This is one of the places where data is changing very, very quickly. This graph currently ends at 2023. In a number of months, the NSF is expected to release the 2024 data, but I think is what most interests to people probably in the academia and is what's going to be happening with the 2025 data. There, we've been looking at other sources of data. So, for instance, the Department of Homeland Security's Immigration and Customs Enforcement Division has a database called SEVIS. And because of the interest in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics students, they actually purposely segregate out visa holders who are coming to study in STEM topics. Now, this leads to some interesting issues dealing with data sources that are outside the NSF. For many months, the SEVIS database removed all of its data, and it became very hard for us to track the STEM students who were in that database. Checking just a week ago, suddenly all of that data has now reappeared, and I've frantically downloaded in case it disappears again in the future. But it's a challenge in our current environment where data comes and goes. And this is something that we're concerned about with the NSF as well, the NCSES. As you know, the overall NSF budget under the president's budget request had over a 50% proposed cut. The National Center for Science, Engineering, and Statistics, which is producing all of this high quality gold standard data, was no exception to that cut. They had on the order of a 60% proposed cut in the NSF budget request. Now, what will actually happen in the future is unknown. The appropriations, as we noticed, are still in process, but we really appreciate this gold standard data set and hope that it continues. But meanwhile, we're exploring other sources of data, as I said, like the Department of Homeland Security, so that we'll be able to at least produce some data even as data sources come and go. And I think at that, I will pass back and we'll start answering more questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much to both of you, Kate and Chris. We do have a couple of questions that we have not yet addressed that just appeared. So I'll just start in order. Question from Mike Henry. And if you don't want your name mentioned, then click anonymous, please. With some offices in NOAA and EPA being eliminated or targeted to be eliminated, it would be helpful to have those agencies' R&D illuminated rather than lumped under, quote, other agencies. Can that be done with the data available?
So this data set, no. So they do not. This is, as I said, comes from a source called the HERD, the Higher Education Research and Development Survey. The NSF doesn't separate out specific agencies beyond other. In this data set, there is another data set just about federal agencies, but it's not focused on universities in the same way that this is. It's just about all of their R&D spending. So for that level of microdata, I'm happy to chat with people offline about how to explore the NCSES data set. The other place to look, of course, is the AAAS and AIP, where they do, on the appropriations level, try to dive into specific agencies.
Okay, so Mike Henry, if you want to contact Chris Martin and continue that discussion, that'd be great. Question from Josh Bowerman. In the indicator tool, would sponsored research outsourced by a corporation be accounted for as corporate R&D expenditure, or is R&D a very specific standalone category? Or does the tool not reflect that level of granularity in the data it highlights?
So it does. So if the performer of the research is universities, even if business, so I've highlighted this business wedge down here. So this is business as a funder at universities and nonprofit research organizations. That is captured. So when business is what's doing the outsourcing and is the source of funds, that would be captured in that sense. Now, if business is funding subcontracting to another business, that's business to business. There is a distinction in the NSF data that we're not showing here about business to business self-funded versus business to other business. So it is possible to capture that if you really care, but we're not, we're just lumping business to business, not separating business to self, business to other. And there's also business to foreign business as well that they capture as well.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a question from Juliana Churston. Returning to the introductory talks, are you advocating for philanthropists to, quote, pick up the slack from any near-term government scientific funding reduction? And if so, might we risk disincentivizing future government investment if it's believed that private donors can take care of it? So I'll give a short answer to that, and Bob, you can as well. But it's I don't I don't view it. I wouldn't use the words pick up the slack. I mean, foundations, especially in foundations, comprise our members of our organization, have commitments to their charters, to their boards, to their grantees that have been longstanding, and they, of course, want to continue that commitment. That said, this is important time for rainy day funds. So, and because of their commitment, especially to their grantees, they are trying to ensure that we have the next generation of scientists. And so there is a lot of discussion, a lot of funding, increased funding that is going towards young investigators, graduate students, postdocs, and early faculty who need startups. So, and there have been articles written. I wrote one of them for the Stanford Social Innovation Review or something like that, SSIR, that talks about ways that philanthropists can increase their giving. The most salient thing is that there's just so much uncertainty right now with how the budgets are going to finally land, and you all know that. And so it's it's difficult to judge exactly where you can make the most impact. And so the philanthropists get together in various venues on webinars like this, and some of them are very small with just the heads or program officers of foundations. They get together in person. Our SPA meetings are an example. There are other meetings that are going on. And they talk about what they're doing. Some have increased their endowment payouts to help. So there are many different things that are going on. Partnerships, I would say, is another big thing. Where can they add leverage by increasing their partnerships with each other? So there are many reactions, but I think the main one that I would hold is that there's just a lot of uncertainty until the federal budgets settle out of where exactly one's funding, additional funding, can have the most impact. Bob, if you'd like to answer or add to that, please go ahead.
Yeah, just briefly. I think the straightforward answer to the question, fill the gap, is you can't. So we're not advocating that you should somehow philanthropy. It doesn't have a large enough spigot to fill the gap. That's why I commented about the situation with graduate students and the human capital element of the scientific enterprise. These are very hard choices. I'll give you just one. If you have a young faculty member who's lost their funding, and you have a very senior faculty member who's in their 60s, or her in their 60s, and they have had a long career, in 20 years, who's going to be around? So my argument would be just to think about, if it's human capital for the future, you may have to say, I want to emphasize finding a way to support young investigators and finding a way to support graduate students. these are they're Faustian bargains. Why leave this group out? Why leave that group out? There's no answer to the question, why leave anybody out? These are what are called really hard decisions. And I think I'm simply remarking that extreme times call for really hard decisions. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Bob. So Amanda Stout asked a question which I believe, Chris, you already addressed, but I think it's just worth repeating. Does the report include changes in non-federal funding in 2024 and 2025? If not, are there other efforts available to capture this data, especially if this level of funding is also changing quickly? So I guess the nuance there is that it's not the federal data, because you talked about that, but the non-federal data, like the philanthropy and industry data.
So there are other efforts. So the graph that I showed only showed the federal. The other sources only were valid up through 2023 because that's what's in the NSF report. I have been diving into the IRS 990 filings, which is one of the other places of capturing the other sources of funding. It's coarser and it's harder to calibrate, and so it's not the sort of thing that can be integrated easily with the NSF data. This is the importance of the NSF really being the gold standard. They work very hard to make sure there's no double counting and that everything has been, all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. So, I could say I could have a rough draft of 2024, but it's hard to, calibrate it with previous years.
Yeah, thank you. So Susan Roberts asked a very interesting, unanswerable question, but we'll put it out there as a thought question. In addition to the loss of support for students and postdocs, there's the loss of critical scientific expertise at the federal science agencies. So are there any plans for supporting some of the federal scientists who have been let go? And we'll just let our philanthropic foundations think about that one. Daniel Lee says the report shows that universities themselves self-fund 19.2 billion, 17% of research expenditures. What are the risks of universities increasing internal self-funding, for example, via debt, tuition, patents?
Well, I would say the financial situation for most universities right now is dire.
Yeah.
And so taking on debt for which you need resources to pay the debt down in the future can be a highly risky adventure. This is not the same as, let's say, 2008 and 2009, where you have an economic collapse. There, universities understand economics, and they understand things don't last forever, and they are willing to borrow to cover costs. And Yale and Harvard famously had to borrow because they didn't have the liquidity in their endowments necessary to fund the operations that were necessary by the university. But in this circumstance, we're in new territory. And I think it would be very risky for universities to decide that they're going to cover additional losses of federal funding through, for example, borrowing to try to sustain the federal levels of funding. And I'm familiar with the situation here at UC San Diego, and it's been made very clear that the administration, University of California, is not going to be capable of replacing lost federal funding.
Mm-hmm.
And I would expect that that's the kind of decision you'll see at almost every university. It's just an impossible financial situation.
Yeah, and they're all very different. I'm on a couple of university boards also, and they're very different one to the other, and they will be impacted in different ways. And so part of the challenge of leadership now for university presidents and their vice presidents and all their administrations is to paint different scenarios of what could happen if, because there are a lot of big ifs out there. There's the big if on indirect cost funding, and if that will be capped, and what exactly will happen with federal funding support and so forth. So it's a challenging environment that we live in. So Kevin Lee asks, do you have any concerns about the availability or integrity of data sets supported or maintained by federal agencies? That's a very interesting, relevant question to us. Given Freeze's uncertainty, would it be prudent to consider data preservation strategies or international efforts? Maybe, Kate, I'll turn to you. You've been very involved with various SPA's efforts in this regard. There's other groups, one called FACTS, that is working hard on this, and I'm sure there are others as well. But this is an important question, Kevin, and there's a lot that's being done to address this. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Kate.
I would say we're looking at this for a number of different angles. Chris already talked about the availability of data for this very report. We're expecting that there'll be a new release of data in February for 2024, and we'll be eager to update the report if it's available. But of course, we know that there's some uncertainty in that situation. But then also more broadly around the scientific funding data sets, and that's an area that the Alliance has been interested in for a long time now, and some philanthropic funders in our network have been funding groups like the National Academies, for example, to look at the sustainability of both on biomedical and Earth observations data. And so it's definitely something that we're engaged in, both in terms of the data for this report and more broadly. And I think that thinking internationally is really important. And that's even a direction that we could take the report in the future, looking at some of the international data.
Thank you. We're coming close to the end of our time, but let's try to do a couple quickly. So Deborah Shapley asks if this report has anything on public attitudes towards science and scientific research. It doesn't, but there are lots of reports that do. And so if you want to contact us, we can give you a list of those. I mean, certainly the AAAS, the Research America, keep, or at least two organizations, probably others, many others, that really do have a lot to say about public attitudes and doing survey on that. And you have in your question about the Pew Foundation, they really keep on top of this. So, but that's not the remit of this particular report. Let's see if we can answer one or two more in our time. Let's see, anonymous, the investment per capita for early investigators and or fellows may be more amenable to foundations as well. Yes. Versus a more established investigator with a larger project or program budget. But these are two distinctly important funding cohorts that have critically important contributions to make. Absolutely. Completely agree with that. And what we see is that there are a lot of foundations that have been doing for some time funding fellows programs. And there are other newer ones. In fact, we talk to them. Part of what we do is advise new philanthropists who are interested in getting into this space. So it's a good space to get into. There are other philanthropists, many of them individual private ones with huge sums of money that are funding the big efforts, the big new institutes, research institutes and the like, and developing new schools of science like computer science and others at our universities. And so you're absolutely right, Anonymous, that both are really important to keep in mind. Okay, I'm just trying to read quickly here. Curious about individual donor family philanthropy trends in support of university R&D, perhaps parsing larger professionally staffed foundation support from family shops. Yes, we can. That's certainly a discussion that we can have with you. Why don't you just contact us? We can let you know what's happening, and that's worthy of a separate discussion. So I think that we have just lots more that we can't all answer, but Sue Merrilees, who's one of our senior science philanthropy advisors, says that the Internet Archive has been downloading data since November of 2025. They were up to 1 trillion web pages. Okay. And we'll close with a question from Bruce Darling, because known Bruce for a very long time. Hi, Bruce, glad you're on. Are philanthropic institutions focusing their interests on efforts by European countries and China to recruit scientists and engineers in the US to accept employment offers in Europe, in China. I would say they're certainly aware of that. We all are of specific examples, and I think that that will in time. I mean, this is just all very new and happening now. Well, everybody is certainly concerned about that, but now we just have kind of one-off cases. There isn't any kind of collective data on what is happening, what the impact. That will take some time to gather. So let me just thank
So could I toss
everybody
in
very much. Yes, of
one quick
course.
thing on that?
Yes, of
So
course, Chris.
there are other data sources as relates to the other data source question, but also to this question about international places. I've been downloading data from the European Union, from the UK, and other places, especially about international students. It's harder to get faculty to see where the students from the US are ending up. So that's also an international twist about those international STEM students.
Great, great. And I'll close with a comment I just saw. So, Lisa Nansett said, "I love this report. Thank you for doing this great work." Couldn't have had said it better. Thank you very much to Kate and to Chris and to Bob. It's been such a pleasure working with you on this, and we'll keep doing our best. Please send us comments. Sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions, and that helps us be better and give you better data. Thank you very much. Bye.